Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm really excited to see everyone here. Accessibility-wise, we have CART. Unfortunately, no ASL today due to a miscommunication. But if anyone has other accessibility needs, just let me know. And I am really excited to introduce Dr. Miele. Dr. Miele self-identifies as a blind scientist, designer, and disability activist, focusing on the overlap of technology, disability, and equity. He is a Distinguished Fellow of Disability Accessibility and Design at UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute, as well as a Principal Accessibility Researcher at Amazon's Lab 126. His work integrates universal and inclusive design, accessibility engineering, education research, psychophysics, disability studies, and other disciplines, applying emerging technologies and ideas to a wide range of social and information accessibility challenges. Dr. Miele is well known for his work on a wide range of accessibility tools, and for that work, he is a 2021 MacArthur Fellow. And this event is co-sponsored by the Center for Research and Education on Accessible Technology and Experiences and the Allen School's Distinguished Lecture Series. So thank you so much to both for bringing Dr. Miele to speak with us today. And you take it away. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. What an honor. Thank you so much, Dr. Mankoff, for that great introduction. And also thank you, of course, for inviting me to this. It is an incredible honor to be part of the 504 anniversary, 50th anniversary series. I live in Berkeley, where the 504 activities were a significant component of the disability rights movement in the 70s. I wasn't there at the time, but it is ringing in the air in the Bay Area even today. So it's incredibly wonderful to be here. And I also want to say that it's an honor to be here because this community at University of Washington is one of the largest and most vibrant communities of people thinking and working around disability, accessibility, and technology anywhere. And the kind of work that's going on here is exactly the kind of work that I am so thrilled to be a part of as a community member. And Dr. Mankoff mentioned the MacArthur Fellowship, which I'm incredibly honored to be a recipient of. However, I don't think of it as being mine. I kind of think of it as being ours. It's related to the kind of work I do, which is the kind of work you do. So what I'll be talking about today, my talk is called Accessibility in the Open, Driving Global Disability Equity Through Open Source. And so I'll be talking about a bunch of stuff related to those topics. I'm going to sort of meander on my way to getting to all of the topics I mentioned. I do wear a lot of hats. Today I'm speaking really as sort of my own person, as a researcher. Jen mentioned that I think of myself as a scientist and an activist and an inventor and a pain in the ass, and I do all of those things. And while we are in the Amazon room here, I won't be talking a lot about my Amazon work. That can be a topic for another day. I also want to say that I will not be using any slides today, no PowerPoint, no visuals, and there's a reason for that. There are a couple of reasons, actually. I invite you to think of it as a podcast. Think of it as a text or speech-only presentation. The two reasons why there are no slides is, number one, because, and they're accessibility reasons. Number one is because making slides is an accessibility challenge for me. It takes up a lot of extra time for a blind person to create a compelling deck of slides. It would be really easy for me to set up something that's just a bunch of bullets, but I don't think that that's interesting, and I don't think that's interesting to you, and I think that, in fact, if you can read what's on the CART screen or listen to what I'm saying, you'll get a lot more out of it than if you're trying to parse my bullet points while I'm saying the same things. The other side of it is an equity and accessibility issue for you, the audience. If there are people here who can't see the screen, then there's the potential for me to be showing something that I forget to say or that isn't properly represented verbally. And if I'm trying to represent everything verbally that I'm doing visually, why do I need to do both? Now, it's possible, of course, that there are folks here whose processing would be helped by the redundant audio and visual components. And to those people, I apologize. But maybe the cart will go some distance towards helping with that. As I said, I want you to think of it as a podcast. Think of it as something that you are listening to. And if maybe when sighted people close their eyes, they tend to fall asleep. So don't do that, okay? But try to be with me. And I might poll you once in a while to see if you're still here. So be ready. It's like a pop quiz kind of thing. Now, before I get too far into it, I want to define some terms. And they're my definitions. And if you know of other ones, that's fine. These are the ones that I sort of work with in my own mental model of accessibility and design as I go through the work that I do. First, I want to talk about accessibility, which in one sentence is usability for people with disabilities. That's it. Now, there's lots to be said about it. Accessibility is really the technical side of disability inclusion. It's the work that we do with our tools and our systems and our, the other mechanisms that we engage with, whether they're cities or rooms or websites or programs. And it's the changes that we make or the accommodations that we add to those things that make those things usable and enjoyable and equally an equitable and similar experience for everyone, including people with disabilities. Disability is a huge field. There are so many different ways to be disabled, to have a disability. And so accessibility is almost always aspirational. There are almost no experiences that I can name that are accessible to everyone. So that needs to be acknowledged kind of up front. And whenever you ask about accessibility, the first question I think you should always ask is accessible to whom? Because there will always be someone who's going to get left out of the mix. And that's just, it doesn't mean that we're trying to leave people out. It means that we want to minimize the number of people that are being left out. I want to highlight a couple of specifics about accessibility and my definition of it. It includes the amount of time that something takes. Like if something is going to take, if you make an accessible experience and it's going to take me as a blind person 10 times longer to do it than it would for a sighted person, that's not accessible. I may be able to do everything. I may be able to click all the buttons or get all the information. But if it takes me longer, that's not really part of the experience. And similarly, if I'm able to do everything that's part of the experience, but not able to enjoy it in the same way that it was intended to be enjoyed or used or interacted with, then again, we have missed the mark. So in designing and creating accessible experiences for people with disabilities, we're really after an experience that is enjoyable in the same way, in the same time, and in the same context. There are lots of examples I can give, but for this group, I think that's probably good enough. I also want to talk about in my list of definitions, I want to go to ableism. And ableism is a word that we hear more and more about, and it's a very important concept because it really is, it's about a mindset. Ableism is essentially a mindset that kind of deprioritizes and dehumanizes people with disabilities, either because they don't count as much, they're not worth as much, they are not as important, or otherwise sort of downgrading their agency and humanity. it's not always, ableism is not an intentional thing usually. It's often fear-based. It's often built on assumptions because people don't know people with disabilities. If you know people, there are an enormous number of cultural specifics around ableism. Different cultures have different ableist ideas, but ableism is pervasive. It's pervasive in the language, it's pervasive in the systems that we interact with, and it's pervasive in the tools that we use and the tools that we are given to use as disabled people. And that's really largely, that's one of the main topics that I'm going to be talking about, and how to sort of think our way and design our way out of that box. Because while accessibility is the technical side of disability inclusion, there's a social side. And I've been talking to a number of the students about this already, so you still with me? Don't fall asleep yet, okay? But ableism pervades what we do, and the social side of disability inclusion is a much bigger and more difficult problem than the technical accessibility side. We can build gadgets, we can figure out technical accommodations, we can build accessible websites, but if we are still thinking about people with disabilities in ableist terms, then we're not going to get there. We're not going to get to a society that I think we're all sort of aiming at, that includes people with disabilities as equals, where we don't have to do all of this extra fighting to be at the table, to be in the room where it happens. And that's really a very important thing. We can make the tools work, but the systems are very often still ableist. So the harder side of this problem is a social problem, and designing or thinking of ways to sort of interrupt the ableism that is really everywhere, and in particular in the tools that we have, the tools that we use, the tools that we need. You know, humans are tool-making creatures, and there are those who would point to our ability to use tools and our cute little thumbs as being a huge part of what has got us to where we are today, and in many of the fixes that we find ourselves. But tools are really important, and if you build tools that aren't usable by a significant set of your population, you are inherently building in inequity. And so the tools you get reflect the mindset of the designer. You get it's ableism in, ableism out. That's and so I'll be talking more about my sort of response to that. So not all people need to use the same tools. There's so long as the tools get the job done, there are lots of different paths. And so people with disabilities are experts at using different workflows to get the same stuff done. And many people without disabilities also use alternate workflows. An example is reading, right? So you can read a book, you can pick up a paperback and read it, or you can listen to it on an audiobook, or you can read it in Braille on paper, or as a Braille display, using a Braille display. There are lots of different ways to read a book. They all get the same job done. They're different tools. And most of the time, people don't care what tool you use. And it doesn't matter to you which tool you use to get that job done. But sometimes we need to use the same tools. Sometimes if you don't engage in the same systems that people without disabilities are using, you sort of other yourself. And you build, this is in the mainstream world, an example is, if you're not using the word processor I'm using, then you can't read my comments, and you can't, track my changes, and you can't collaborate with me effectively. So by having different tool paths, by different tool sets, people with disabilities are often left out of the the main flow of work. So it's a real consideration, and this is why we need to, it's not good enough to just say, well, we have alternate ways of doing that. We need to make sure that the tools we're using as people with disabilities, and in particular, I'm thinking of blind people now, the tools that we're using need to be the same tools in many cases. Otherwise, even though we can get the same job done, we're disconnected from where it's happening. We're not in the room where it's happening. So I personally do accessibility, or I should say, I do accessibility because we as people with disabilities need good tools. And it's a mission that is critical. It's important work to be done. And I personally do accessibility because I know that the way I do it is going to be user-centered and inclusive, at least to the extent that I can, and I'm always looking to get better. And I could tell you a lot more about my own personal path, but I'm going to skip forward. And I want to tell you, I've done a lot of fun accessibility work around access to information for blind people. And by the way, another definition I'll throw at you. When I say blind, I'm not talking about totally blind people only. I'm talking about anybody with a visual disability who might self-identify as blind or who might need extra tools. So it's just a shorthand. You guys still with me? Yes. Okay. You know, and that's an alternate tool, right? If I could see, I would just look around and see who's sleeping. But it's just another way of getting it done. So, and it wakes you up. Not all accessibility is web accessibility, but the web accessibility people would have you believe that. No shots, I'm just saying. So the kind of accessibility that I like the best is off the beaten track. It doesn't have guidelines. It doesn't have a set of requirements that have been written down and codified at the W3C or anywhere else. The kind of accessibility that I like best is thinking about how to make unusual experiences accessible for, in particular, for blind and visually impaired people. But I like to, as I said earlier, I come from Berkeley. I think about things in a pan-disability context. So whenever I design something, even if it's for blind people, I try to think about the people who have additional disabilities, the people who have disabilities, the people that are not blind but want to use the tools anyway, et cetera. So sort of inclusive design and universal design, which I know is, you know, to some people is now anathema, but I think it still has a lot to teach us, is the best stuff is stuff that has not yet been thought all the way through and hasn't been written down in a cookbook. And my favorite kind of project is one that does something for people, one that while you're doing the research or the prototyping or the investigation, you can put it out there into the wild and let people play with it and get feedback from your users. And while doing that, it makes people think. In a sense, my entire career has kind of been built on accessibility that straddles the line between super useful and performance art. And I love that because it's really important to, you know, number one, it's important to provide tools that people can use. And number two, if we're going to get anywhere, we need to teach as we go. We need to demonstrate and sort of help people over the hurdle of understanding why this tool is even necessary. And I'm not talking about the people that the tools are aimed for. I'm talking about the other people. So, so I'll give you a few examples of things that I've worked on that kind of do this straddling performance art acrobatic thing. TMAP, the Tactile Maps Automated Production, but you know, if I had a slideshow, I'd be putting up a big slide that says TMAP with a big, you know, picture of a TMAP, but TMAPs are really visually uninteresting because they're just tactile street maps, and they're generally printed on, they're tactile markings on white paper. They're really hard to make good slides of, which may be why I had trouble getting it funded. So TMAP was a thing that I started working on right out of grad school. It was my first project as a postdoc, and I built it out of tools that I had, out of tactile representation tools that I had built for MATLAB. In grad school, I had to build a whole audio and tactile representation toolbox so that I could look at my own data. And when I started my postdoc, I wanted to do this street mapping problem. Street maps are really important. Blind people get around in many different ways, but we have never had good access to tactile representations of the streets where we live. It's easy to get a tactile map of the United States and the borders between the states. It's easy to get a world map of the outlines of the continents, but if you want a map of how to get to the corner store, or how to get to school from your house, or how to get to your new job, you didn't have it before TMAP existed. So I rolled together a bunch of existing technologies, GIS, geographical information systems, Braille embossers, and the web, so that people could go to a website, specify in text the kind of map they wanted, the name of the place they wanted the center of the map to be on, the scale of the map, what kind of embosser they were using, and then they could download a file and print it out on their own Braille embosser. It sounds so simple and basic, but until this was available, blind people did not have any spatial representations of the street networks where they were operating. And it's very frustrating to navigate into a new place without any perspective on how the streets connect to each other. So there are lots of reasons why TMAP is so awesome. There's another story about how I built similar maps in collaboration with the San Francisco Lighthouse of the BART stations, the rapid transit system in San Francisco, and I asked BART for maps of the stations so that we could create tactiles out of them, and I had a feeling they weren't going to get back to me, so I rallied together a whole bunch of volunteers who went into the BART stations. Over the course of a couple of weekends, they mapped all the BART stations, and BART still hasn't gotten back to me. So, so maps are hugely important, but the performance art part of it, in addition to the army of volunteers going through the stations and mapping out all the features of the BART stations, is that a lot of people didn't understand, including blind people, didn't understand why maps were even important. Without access to street maps, a lot of blind people didn't think they needed them. They didn't recognize that this was a thing that would help them. And so they didn't use them. They didn't learn how to use them. There was research that showed that people weren't good at reading tactile maps, which was, of course, just based on lack of experience. And so it goes around, right? We didn't have mapping resources because people didn't think it was interesting or important. But now we do. I'll jump to another of my projects called UDescribe, which I'm incredibly proud of, and which is another real sort of example of utility and teaching. And it does it in a number of different ways. It's basically a web-based tool that allows anybody anywhere to create audio descriptions of any YouTube video and share that description with the world without the need to copy, redistribute, or otherwise violate YouTube's terms of service. I won't get into how it does it, but it's very cool. And at the time when I did it, there was no none of the, there was no audio description on Netflix, there was no audio description on Amazon. Very little audio description was available on broadcast TV or cable. There was almost no audio description around in 2013 when UDescribe was launched. And the audio description that was available was created by professionals who had a very specific idea of how it should be done. UDescribe allowed anybody to create audio description, which really opened up not only the availability of described cat videos and described fried chicken recipes and described how to build this IKEA bed videos, but also opened up the possibility for people to experiment with how audio description could and should be done. And so it was really, it's a great way to introduce people to the idea of description as accessibility tools. So UDescribe is just a really fun thing. If you haven't checked it out, I invite you to do it, udescribe.org. I'm going to tell you about another thing that I don't think I've ever talked about this publicly. But there was I was into maps and wayfinding tools and GPS and all of this. But I also like things that are funny. And one of the things that's really funny and also just a little heartbreaking and is just kind of about ableism and people's misunderstanding of blind people, whenever you as a blind person go out in the world, you're almost always accosted by well-meaning sighted strangers who want to help out. They want to tell you which way to go. They want to tell you how to cross the street, whether or not you are crossing the street. They want to tell you, sometimes they grab onto you. A lot of the time their information is really unreliable. So I created an iPhone app called Simulated Sighted Stranger that you could shake your iPhone and it would give you a random piece of unhelpful advice. It would say things like, a little to your right, I mean left. Or no, straight, I mean, no, go straight. Or things like that. And so, and I had a whole bunch of great recordings and we tested it and used it. And I launched it in the App Store. It was up for about 2 hours before Apple took it down. And they said that they were taking it down because they thought blind people might find it offensive. And I said, no, the blind people aren't going to find it offensive. The sighted people might find it offensive, but blind people aren't going to think it's offensive. And the concept of it, sort of like this magic 8-ball of advice, I really wanted it to be this great tool that every blind person would have on their iPhone and show to sighted people and be like, isn't this funny? And have the sighted people be like, well, explain why it's funny, and sort of, help move the needle that way. I don't know. Maybe Apple was right. There's also the Blind Arduino project, which is sort of a grassroots set of workshops and meetups and some web resources that are all about helping blind and sighted people understand how blind people can use the tools of the robotics, hobby robotics world to build cool stuff independently. You don't need to be able to see to build cool stuff with Arduino or Raspberry Pi or any number of the other cool microprocessor-based boards that are available these days. You just need to know how to do it. And this gets back to my thing about using alternative techniques, using alternate tools, right? I want blind and sighted kids to be working together to learn about how they can do this stuff, because I want the blind kids to learn how to do it and be empowered. I want the sighted kids to recognize that blind people can do this no sweat, just it requires different skills. And I want the teachers to understand that the whole point of this kind of project-based experiential learning is to open your mind about what can be done. And if the blind kids aren't part of this process, then they're not going to have access to the same opportunities in college or as they grow into their careers. So I really want blind kids to have the same opportunities, and I want sighted kids to grow up learning alongside blind kids about how to do this so that when they get their fancy tech jobs, they remember about the fact that building stuff and doing unusual things that appear difficult, that a sighted person might assume is difficult, is actually just a matter of thinking about how it could and should be done from the perspective of the person doing it, the blind person. And this applies across lots of disabilities. The other thing that the Blind Arduino project really tries to teach is how to design accessible UIs with simple tools that are available off the shelf. Like I use servos all the time as meters, as gauges. Just you put tactile markings around half a circle and have the arm of the servo point to the value that you want, and you've suddenly got an accessible, a quantitative accessible output system for something very simple and cheap. You don't need to make it talk, and it's accessible for blind people and for deafblind people. So it's just a super cool approach, and there are lots of different. You can use vibrotactors, you can use sound, you can use all sorts of stuff, and there is some speech available there. But the Blind Arduino project touches a lot of different parts of my performance art / getting things actually done requirements. I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff. I don't think I have time to talk about all of my babies. I won't talk about my, as I said earlier, I won't be talking about my fun work at Amazon. I won't be talking about the work that I do with lots of different blindness organizations to sort of promote STEM accessibility for people with disabilities and just sort of empowerment in general. But it's there. What I do want to sort of wrap up with is I promised you some stuff about open source. And while Arduino and Raspberry Pi are plenty open sourcey, that's not really what I meant. So one of the things that happened to me when the MacArthur people came along was I had to ask myself, what am I going to do with this? This is, and I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about the notoriety, the opportunity for people to actually listen to me who definitely weren't listening before. And there's an idea that I've been working on for probably about 15 years that I've been thinking, I thought it was one of the projects that I just wouldn't be able to do. You can't, if you had 3 lives, you could do a lot more. And I thought that this was one of the things that was going to have to go sort of by the wayside. But I realized that it's really important. And I'm talking about an organization that I'm trying to found called the Center for Accessibility and Open Source. And the rest of what I talk about is really going to be focused on what that is and why it's important. So the Center for Accessibility and Open Source, or CHAOSS, thank you. It's really about global digital equity for people with disabilities. It is about making low-cost, accessible tools available to everyone, whether they have financial resources or not. We want people to be able to use the same tools that other people are using. We want people to have access to the open source tools that everyone else does, and we want them to be able to use those tools to do the things they want to do, to build their lives, to achieve the goals that they may have that without those tools they wouldn't have. So And we need to do it sustainably. We need to do it in a way that is not that is integrated with what's happening in the open source world. It's not a thing where we're going to parachute in. We want to build an organization and a community that is really sustainable and includes people with disabilities. This is an accessibility. I can't. It's an open source organization that embodies modern accessibility and disability sensibilities, right? So it is, and it really is. It really is the only organization, or will be the only organization, that focuses, whose mission is accessibility and open source. There are plenty of other organizations that, there are plenty of open source organizations that, that might think a little bit about accessibility. I don't think that there are any disability organizations that think much about open source. But this organization will put those things at the center of its mission. The mission is really to support, to help open source communities that already exist build their accessibility and disability awareness muscle, to be able to help existing open source communities think more clearly about how they want to integrate people with disabilities into their community, which is a huge prerequisite to doing good accessibility. And we also want them to build accessibility knowledge and skill. We want them to know what resources are out there. How do we triage these accessibility issues? How do we do code reviews on accessibility pull requests? How do we make accessibility actually happen? So we'll be supporting large organizations, and of course we can't do it all at once. We'll be prioritizing, figuring out who the early partners are, prioritizing based on the importance to the community, both of open source community and the disability community. And we're thinking about this globally. We're thinking about this not from a US-centered viewpoint, but from the impact, in particular in developing countries where people with disabilities have much less access to the kinds of technologies that we all have. The other side of the mission is to support accessibility open source projects. There are many open source projects that focus explicitly on accessibility. I'm using one right now. The NVDA screen reader is a completely open source project run mostly by blind people who need the tools themselves to have good access to Windows machines. And it's free, it's excellent, and it's really mostly run by about, maybe if I'm being generous, let's say 5 people. There's a big community around it, but most of them are just cheerleaders. The work is done by a very small handful of people. And they also, they don't have a lot of resources. They don't have money, and they don't have a large enough community to be sustainable if anything bad happened. For example, we had a Braille translator, LibLouis, which is an open source Braille translator. It's used in almost every screen reader you can name. It is a component of NVDA. It is a component of VoiceOver on iOS and on the Mac. It's an open source utility that is essential to accessibility for mainstream computers, even if they're commercial. And the owner died. He died. And he was like the only guy doing it. So it's essential that we create mechanisms, we create structures that support these tiny little communities that are working on really important accessibility tools. And that we find communities that are working on important accessibility tools that we don't even know about, and support them financially and with resources, human resources, volunteers, et cetera. So how it's a lofty goal. I think one of the folks I was talking to earlier said, well, that's great. How the hell are you going to do that? And I think, as I said, we're going to start slow. We'll find a few projects to collaborate with, and we'll work with them and expand out from there. And I think that we will also be looking at ways of funding and supporting internships for college students where we actually embed the student into a given community that needs support. That'll be a teaching opportunity for that student. It'll be a learning opportunity for the community and the people that they're working with. And if we do it right, and if it's a positive experience, that student won't disappear at the end of the summer. That student will probably stick around and take that on as, if not a lifelong community to be part of, at least be around for a few years. And that's the kind of sustainable open source accessibility we're talking about. I think we will also be sponsoring hackathons, workshops, maybe conferences to bring together the people who are most likely to be the movers, shakers, actors, funders in this new. It's not a new movement. There is a movement out there. There are people who have been working very hard on accessibility and open source, but we need to bring us all together, and we need to have an organization whose job it is to bring us together and to make us be effective. And of course, we want to collaborate with other open source and disability organizations with whom we have common cause, including universities and nonprofits and for-profits. There are plenty of companies that care about accessibility and who use open source tools and who are already putting resources into supporting open source efforts. Think Android, think React Native. Again, this will bring low-cost, reliable tools to people who need them. We need eye trackers. We need AAC tools. We need Braille translators. We need screen readers. We need word processors, component libraries, databases, productivity tools. We need all sorts of stuff. And it's not just software, right? There's an active open source hardware movement. It overlaps with right to repair and medical ethics, and it's really big. It's about independent travel. It's about independent work. It's about self-determination, and much more. So there are a lot of proprietary, for proprietary software, there are forces working in favor of accessibility. They include, things like legislation and public relations and customer needs, and there is no such. There currently are no forces in the open source world that are pushing accessibility. Chaos needs to be that force. I think I'm out of time, but I'll just say that if you're interested in global equity and disability and direct action and performance art and chaos, get in touch and let's do this together, because this is incredibly important work and we need your help. Thank you. So speaking of alternate tools, there's a way that blind people facilitate questions. If you want to ask a question and the facilitator is blind, generally what we do is, call out your name, interrupt, whoever's speaking, and just say, Smith, Joe, whatever, and I'll put you in my mental queue, and we'll call on you. If you forget and raise your hand, then Jen will call on you. Go, Richard.
Yeah, just a quick question about, a lot of the things that you're talking about rely on people having some knowledge to start with. and there is not a lot of teaching of accessibility at universities.
Yeah.
So how important is that, and what can be done to make that happen?
It's super important, and sort of speaking from my Amazon perspective, I am really interested in helping candidates out of college be as disability and accessibility aware as possible, no matter what role they're going into. I think that the organization Teach Access is an incredibly important one. I'm looking forward to partnering with them through Chaos. I've told them about it, they're into it. And I'm also working on, I'm at Berkeley as a fellow there. I'm working on an open source disability and design curriculum intended for engineers and designers at the undergrad level, which will use disability technology and accessibility tools as sort of the objects of discussion, but which is really secretly a disability studies class about disability history, disability culture, disability philosophy. And it's because the most important thing for people to understand going into the tech world is it's not about WCAG, it's about disability. Without disability, there is no accessibility. And if you want to do accessibility right, it needs to be done from first principles, from the ground up, from a perspective of disability. You need to understand how disabled people use their tools and the context, the social contexts they're in before you can design good tools or help or collaborate with them to design good tools. So that's sort of what I personally want to do about it, and I think that there are lots of other people who are also thinking about this same problem. Matt?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm Matt. Really appreciate you coming to speak with us today. My question is about open source accessibility and funding models. I love NVDA as maybe one of those like champions of the open source community, but as someone who's really involved in open source right now, I'm struggling to kind of figure out what sustainable funding models look like. And I'm curious if you have any examples of either successful patterns or anti-patterns, things that we should avoid when we think about how to fund accessible open source.
I think that funding accessible, so the corporations and philanthropists don't like to give individuals money. They like to give organizations money. And so I think that one of the essential pieces is to have an organization that can accept funding from philanthropic organizations, from individuals, from corporate entities to support the work that it's doing and that work is going to directly support open source projects. I think that that's the way to go. And I think that in addition, Chaos will, for example, be able to, so NVDA is run by NV Access, which is an Australian organization. NV Access is a nonprofit in Australia, but when I give them money, I can't write it off, okay? So one thing that Chaos will be able to do, an explicit thing that I want it to be able to do, is take donations in the US as a nonprofit so that they're tax deductible for the donors and pass them along to, totally above board. I'm not suggesting anything funny, but to be able to fund international nonprofits that are working on accessible open source in their local communities. So I think that's another important mechanism to sort of unlock the ability of Americans, people in the US that is, to support global accessibility work in open source.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I worked at an open source company for years, and we had an accessibility team that was dedicated to that, but it was focused on one product. And there were many other products like mobile browsers and other things that were coming out that weren't able to get bandwidth from the accessibility team, and the devs working on that team had very little knowledge of accessibility. So what would be the best way if you're coming in as somebody who has knowledge in accessibility, how would you recommend kind of ramping up that knowledge and training teams like that? Because I feel like a lot of us are involved in projects like that.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is since open source projects are community-based, almost always, I think that it requires people who care about that open source project, who also know about accessibility, to get involved and to sort of help the other maintainers build accessibility capacity, to build knowledge in the community. Because we want to do this sustainably. We don't want the accessibility effort of a particular project to be dependent on a single person. And so that's one way, is to get to encourage people through internships and volunteer opportunities to get involved in specific projects that they know and care about. And also, I think that one of the other roles of CHAOSS will be to have lots of online accessibility resources specifically focused on the owner or contributor who doesn't have a lot of accessibility and disability background, and who doesn't have a lot of time to deal with it, who isn't being paid to do it, needs to be motivated to build understanding, to build. So I want to, and we don't have these resources yet, right? This is a thing that, and maybe you can help us think about it. What kinds of resources would be useful? But that's what I'm thinking about right now, and I think helping. One big thing I think for people who don't understand about accessibility is helping them triage the existing accessibility backlog, because they don't have the experience to even. They just look and they say, "Oh my God, I've got 50." Issues that are accessibility related. I don't even know where to start. I'm not touching that stack. But if we could bring other people in to help them triage those and say, oh, you know what, these 25 issues are actually all the same. And to say, you know what, these other 5 issues actually aren't accessibility issues. It's just that this person is using an outdated screen reader or something like that, right? Just to somebody who knows what they're doing to look at that backlog and help them sort of understand it. And then, as I said earlier, to do code reviews, and et cetera.
This is Jen, just jumping in because we are basically out of time. So that's going to be our last question, but we do have a reception afterwards. And I just want to thank our speaker so much for sharing your vision with us.
Thank you.